Recorded live from Hong Kong and Toronto. Let's go! This is the PR and Law Podcast.
The PR and Law Podcast.
Turn it up. With your hosts, Cam McMurchie and Ewan Christie.
Welcome to episode number 20 of the PR and Law Podcast. I'm your co-host, Cam McMurchie, along with Ewan Christie.
Hello, Cameron.
Ewan's an employment lawyer and partner at Duntroon LLP in Toronto, Canada, and online at duntroonllp.law. I'm a PR guy based in Hong Kong and publisher of the Digital Bits PR and Communications newsletter at digitalbitspr.com. If you enjoy the podcast, please tell a friend, get the word out. We appreciate that a lot. And you can follow us on LinkedIn to make sure you don't miss an episode. Actually, on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And our account name is PR Law Podcast, all one word, PR Law Podcast. You can support us on Patreon as well by going to our website, prlawpodcast.com, and click support the show. And we're happy to take your questions as well. You can tag us on social media with the hashtag PRLawPod. We will get your question and we will answer it in a future show. Ewan, what's happening?
Oh, I'm good, Cam. So I want to, first of all, I got to give a shout out to my lovely wife. And of course, she's also a PR and Law Podcast super fan. It's her birthday today.
Oh, wow. Happy birthday. And yeah. Is she a super fan on her own accord, or is she kind of feel a bit obligated?
Well, I'm sure it's probably a little column A, a little column B, but it's sort of always a weird thing the day after we load the show, because of course, for the most part, she and I are still working from home, so she'll kind of be in the office, and I'll be walking by, and I'll think, oh, is that me speaking, or I will overhear either you or me. She always listens to the show loyally the day that it's posted while she's sitting working. So I think, I hope she likes it.
You know what's weird though is like, and I don't know if I'm weird with this. I don't know if other people who have podcasts listening to this what you think about it, but like I almost never tell people about the podcast, and I absolutely never tell anyone to listen, but because I feel like it's so presumptuous. Like our show is an hour long and it's dealing on two very, very specific subjects of PR and law, and I just kind of automatically assume that people like that I know are not in these fields would just not be that interested in it. So I don't bring it up. I don't know if that's like a low self-esteem thing, or if that's kind of a practical way to look at it. Because if someone was doing a show on, I don't know, like gardening or pruning hedges or something, and they asked me to listen to an hour of them talking about it, I'd probably feel a little, like I'd be trying to avoid it. So I'd never want to put someone in that position.
Yeah, I'm exactly the same way. I'm certainly not walking around with, a t-shirt advertising the show. Maybe I should be. Maybe that'd be a good idea. But yeah, I don't really make mention of it.
Yeah, that's said,
probably for the same reason. It's like I don't want to be presumptuous in that you would be interested in what we're talking about.
Yeah.
But
that said, though, I mean, I am surprised the number of people that do listen and that message me privately or send me a message through Twitter. It's amazing. It's really, really encouraging. I know Jesse Smith is one of them, who's someone that we have not kept in touch with at all. We knew him years and years ago, and he's, I know, one of the guys that listens each week, and so that's great to hear. Ewan, one of the big things I just wanted to bring up off the top, the Democratic Convention was this week. Did you get a chance to see any of the speeches from that?
Yeah, I did, actually. I saw a bunch. I saw Barack Obama's. I saw Kamala Harris's. I saw Biden's. I even watched Biden's wife's speech. And I watched Bill Clinton's speech as well. So yeah, I saw kind of the big ones.
I wish I could have seen more. I mean, the time difference in Asia is a little bit difficult, but just today I watched President Obama's speech, and I had seen some commentary of it online, including, I think it was David Plouffe or I can't remember if it was Plouffe or Axelrod who worked on his campaign, but said that his speech was actually quite alarmist for him, that it was very, very serious. And so I did watch it, and I thought it was actually an incredible speech. I mean, I know Obama is already, we all know he's quite gifted, a gifted orator, but his speech was a real call to arms that I haven't heard from him before. It was quite powerful.
Yeah, I thought it was good too. It's interesting. I was speaking with a friend of mine who is quite conservative and really despises Obama and cannot stand the way that he speaks. In fact, and we were sort of chatting about the speech, and I suggested that he watch it. I don't know that he did, but I thought what was really effective. One thing that I think has become really frustrating for me in watching politics is this idea, this sense of elitism. There's always this criticism that politicians are coming across as elitist, as if to sound articulate and be well spoken should be considered, a problem as a public speaker and as a politician. I think that that's just fundamentally wrong. And I've watched too many speeches over the years where I feel as though politicians have attempted to quote unquote sort of dumb down the talk. And I think that that's really unfortunate. I think it's insulting the intelligence of your viewership. And I think it sort of takes away from what you bring to the table as an elected official in terms of demonstrating, well, why should we be listening to you? And I think in the past, Obama's had a tendency to sort of, put on this sort of, I don't even know how to describe it. There's something that changes in his cadence, almost as if he's trying to sort of dumb down the talk. And I felt like in this speech, he didn't do that. And it may simply have been that he wasn't doing it in front of a live audience. And I think, and I'm certainly interested to get your take on this, Cam, as a PR guy. But I think that can really play to the advantage of the politician in not having that live audience, right? I mean, it's if it's recorded, a pre-recorded speech, or even if it's just live in front of a camera, they're given a lot more latitude in terms of trying to convey a powerful message.
That's interesting. I had not actually even considered that in this case, but you're absolutely right. Now, usually the crowd is a positive because you can read off the crowd. I mean, it's like a music, like a band or a stand-up comedian. You feed off the energy of the crowd and you develop sort of that conversation on stage with yourself or your band and the crowd. So in general, I think it's a positive thing. But in this case, it looked more like, it reminded me a bit of, George H.W. Bush announcing sort of the liberation of Kuwait or the start of the Gulf War. Because when you're speaking just to a camera, it's very, very intimate. You can see that there's probably only a couple of people in that room with Obama for his speech, the camera guy and maybe a couple of producers or something. And it's quiet and he can speak directly to the camera. And I think for this message that he gave, which was a very serious message, and it looks like one he really wants people to listen to and take to heart and then take action on, I think it was a much better setup, a much better environment for that kind of speech in particular. So I think that worked. But in general, I think the crowd does often help quite a bit.
Yeah, I sort of think of this in thinking of film, the idea of if you go back and you try and watch sort of what would be considered a top tier film from the late 50s and compare it with something that came out last year, the way that the actor performs is fundamentally different because, they were dealing in a time where, things were still predominantly in black and white. There's no high definition television. The ability for the camera to convey what the actor was doing was far more difficult. So the actor in the performance had to be bigger. They had to be more exaggerated, more animated. Whereas today, with high definition television, the camera can capture the minutia in someone's face, right? I mean, just the way that they blink or the way that their eye might twinkle or the light catches it. All of those things can be captured by a camera. And I thought that was part of it too in watching Obama's speech, because it was, to your point, that level of intimacy, that the camera captures everything, right? And you can be small, you can be smaller and yet still convey a very, very big message. Whereas when you're sort of in front of a live crowd in a stadium of, tens of thousands of people, it's far more difficult to be quiet when you need to be quiet and to be smaller in terms of conveying your message and facial expression. You lose a lot of that stuff. So I thought that in many regards, it was sort of interesting that it helped make the message almost more effective. And I'm curious to see how the Republican convention sort of reflects that, or if it does reflect that
I think
sense as well.
I don't think it's going to be anything like it. And by the way, so a couple of things I just want to touch on quickly that you mentioned. One, yeah, the HD or the 4K. Oftentimes, I saw it via NBC on YouTube. It was in high def, and yes, yeah, I felt like you could see, because the camera was quite tight. You could see emotion on his face. You could see emotion in his eyes. You could see that it was a difficult message to deliver. I don't think Obama is necessarily a good actor per se. I think you can tell when he's trying to put on some kind of a show or something outside of what he would normally do. So I felt that those things were genuine. But to compare that, I mean, several weeks ago, I can't remember how this happened, but I ended up going down a bit of a YouTube rabbit hole on Jack Parr, the original host of The Tonight Show before even Johnny Carson. And I mean, obviously I've heard his name a few times, but other than that, I don't know anything about him. And I did watch a few old videos. And you're right, Ewan. It's startling, actually, how distant it feels, because the technology back then was quite rudimentary compared to what it is today. And he has to be very big and bombastic, and lots of arm movements and waving around and walking around, because you can't see the details. So those bigger movements become much more important. And I think it's great that now that we can see these small details that can make quite a difference. Yeah, exactly. But again, it will be interesting to see sort of compare and contrast the two conventions. Yeah, I mean, the last thing I'll say,
different approaches
on this too is, President Trump and President Obama have very different speaking styles, needless to say. But President Trump is effective too. I don't necessarily, well, actually, I do in the past. I think I've mentioned this to you before that, I've had friends who just play Trump speeches because they're so ridiculous and entertaining. And it's almost bizarre, like a train crash, like what you might see or hear if you listen to him. But I do think he's been really effective as well in his way of getting the spotlight and getting attention and getting his fans / followers / voters to take action. So it will be interesting to see what the Republicans come up with.
Oh, well, absolutely. And look, and let's be clear here. I mean, whether you loved Obama's speech or you hated Obama's speech, Obama read a speech off of a teleprompter. Right. And I understand he was able to sort of convey the message effectively. We can talk about the fact that he's a good orator, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But ultimately, that wasn't a man speaking off the cuff. And to your point, that is precisely what people love about Trump. And I get that. I get that idea that, he will completely disregard the teleprompters. He will speak off the cuff. He will convey a message that really, really resonates with his audience in a way that few politicians, love him or hate him, but in a way that few politicians have done and have been able to do in some time.
I really want to make this point. I'm glad you brought it up. I don't like the fact that the teleprompter gets a bad rap. And I've heard even my own father gets quite, he uses the teleprompter as a way to kind of bash Obama's speaking. I mean, I've worked with so many companies over the years. A teleprompter is used all the time for politicians of all kinds, for speakers of all kinds at events. They're not like a crutch that, poor people with poor memory rely on or something like that. They're used everywhere. And secondly, if they're not installed, then most people have a written version of their speech that they follow when they're up at the podium or they're on stage. This is the vast, vast majority of everyone who speaks publicly. What Trump does is unique, yes, and he's talented at speaking that way, especially for his own fans. But you would ask, if he's got three, and again, from a PR perspective, you'll say, President Trump, go out there. We want to drill home these three messages. There's a good chance he won't get to those three messages. He'll speak for an hour and a half, and he may not touch on the things that you need him to touch on. So while it's entertaining, it's actually not really an effective way. You have to be very talented to hit those messages and be able to speak off the cuff. So I don't think using a teleprompter is any kind of a knock on somebody at all.
Continue the debate with us on social media. Join us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at PR Law Podcast. All one word, PRLAW Podcast. Send us your questions now by email to askus@prlawpodcast.com. That's all one word, askus@prlawpodcast.com. Or on social media with the hashtag PRLawPod. That's hashtag PRLAWPOD.
So if you recall, way back in episode 12, we spoke briefly about Uber. And this was following a case here in Canada regarding an individual who's been trying to bring a class action proceeding to sue Uber here in Canada on the basis that he believes he's been misclassified as an independent contractor when in fact he should be considered an employee of Uber. And of course, there are all kinds of implications in terms of that distinction, right? I mean, the big ones are if you're classified as an employee, there are things like access to sick pay, unemployment insurance, et cetera, paid vacation, all of these things. And we talked about at the time, Cam, people said, oh, well, it's sort of, that's just, indicative of kind of the left-leaning courts that you've got up there in Canada. And I said, well, actually, that's not entirely true because there's a similar situation brewing down in California, and that I wouldn't be surprised if the California courts sort of lean in a similar direction. And wouldn't you know it, of course, things have come to a head. As you may have seen, Cam, this has been all over the press. And I think it's good that it's all over the press because whether or not you care about Uber and Lyft and ride shares, or you're interested in sort of what's going on in the state, it does speak to the larger implications of the gig economy and the distinction between independent contractors and employees. So, you following me so far?
I am, yes.
Okay, good. So on August 10th, quite recently, a California court ruled that Uber and Lyft drivers are, in fact, employees and not independent contractors under the state's gig work law. This is this AB5 law that we talked about. Again, we talked about this in one of the episodes. I think it was episode 12 as well, Cam. And the AB5, this is a law in California, came into effect in January 1, and it applies this thing known as the ABC test to determine if someone is a contractor or an employee. Okay, so the courts effectively determined, no, Uber and Lyft, your drivers are not, in fact, independent contractors. They are employees. Mm-hmm. So we thought, hey, maybe that's going to be the end of it. But of course, it wasn't. Very quickly, things took a turn. So Uber and Lyft, following the decision, were considering all kinds of options, one of which was just shutting down their operations entirely in the state of California, talking about, this is just it's going to crush our business. And, here's some of the reasons why this is such a big deal, Cam. I mean, we're talking a lot of dough here. Some analysts predict that it would cost Uber basically an additional $500 million a year and Lyft $200 million a year if they had to pay American drivers as employees, right? And of course, everybody knows and everybody understands that this isn't just going to be a California issue, that all of the state legislatures are going to be looking to California to see how this plays out, to then govern what will inevitably be arguments in a number of states. And probably, this is just going to have a domino effect in terms of trying to reclassify drivers as employees rather than independent contractors.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I know, there's the employment law angle here. I know your personal view on Uber and Lyft as well. I think if these companies have to treat their drivers as employees, I think that actually upends the entire business model, and it makes their going concern questionable. So I think it's that big of a deal because it's based on, the drivers are paid a bit, the passengers can get around a little more cheaply. And this is sort of free for people to use as they wish. But I think there's a couple things because in reading about this case, it looks like the challenge is coming from the full-time drivers of Uber and Lyft, and they're saying they're working 40 hours a week and they're relying on it as their primary means of income. And they're saying because of that they should have some benefits or they should have some protections or should be paid as employees. And I understand the argument there, but I think, again, I don't want to get political on something like this, but I do think to some degree that, Uber and Lyft created the service and said drivers may drive under these conditions and they will be paid this way. And no one's held a gun to anybody's head to do it. And they've gone ahead and done it. And I think people have. You're not going to get rich driving Uber. You're not going to get rich driving a taxi either. But it's certainly been a big help to a lot of people. So I think it's a little disingenuous to then turn around and say, you created this, gave me the option to do it. I agreed to do it according to your terms, but now I want you to overhaul your entire business model to suit me. That's a tough sell for me. Yeah, look,
there's a lot of really, really interesting arguments on both sides of this, right? Legal and political. In terms of your first argument, I think it's sort of an easy one to kind of get around from a legal perspective. In theory, any two individuals could contract on any sort of employment relationship. And you could argue that, well, if the employee agreed, then, what does it matter? Well, the reality is that you cannot contract with anyone on anything, and in doing so, contract out of statutory entitlements and rights. This is why we have laws. So even if you agree to contract on something that is outside the parameters or legal framework of a particular statute, that contract by definition is unenforceable. You can't do that. So, but putting that issue aside, one of the things that Uber has said, which is sort of interesting, is there's been this whole argument of, well, but the vast majority of Uber and Lyft drivers are exactly what you think. They're part-time drivers that are driving to sort of supplement their income, to give them some flexibility, all of the sort of arguments that sort of proponents of independent contractor relationships typically make. But what was sort of interesting in kind of digging into the data, Cam, is that, there was a Seattle study that was done that determined that at least 1/3 of those Uber and Lyft drivers work more than 32 hours a week, right? So you think, okay, so basically you've got 1/3 of your driver pool are working something approximating full-time hours. However, according to the study, these drivers account for 55% of all rides through the apps. So they already account for a disproportionate amount of the company's revenue, such that it's almost a little disingenuous to suggest that the vast majority of their drivers would prefer to have this independent contractor relationship. Of course, I'm sure they probably would. But the reality is that these companies, they're not profiting and staying afloat on the basis of their part-time drivers. They're doing so on the basis of their full-time driving pool. And I think that's something that's sort of been lost in the argument.
Yeah, I mean, all of these things I fully understand. Especially the not being able to contract around sort of that arrangement. That's legally speaking, and I get it, and that's why we have a case. I'm looking at it more from a business point of view, because I think if at the end of the day we determine that there cannot be sort of a gig economy this way, set up this way, I think ultimately if we lose Uber and Lyft, if California ends up losing it, I think everyone's worse off as a result. I think the drivers are worse off because it's not like they can just go and get a job as a taxi driver, and I think passengers are worse off in terms of getting around. That said, there are some issues to deal with that are sort of endemic to the United States. I think one being benefits. Obviously, healthcare is a big concern in the U.S. I don't think it should be a concern. I think most of the rest of the world has figured out a way to manage healthcare properly. But nonetheless, that's going to be an issue. And then the second one, And this one to me is a bigger one, which is the cost of insurance. So, I mean, obviously, if you're getting picked up by a driver who is, working through Uber, you still want to know that you're protected and that your family's protected if they're in that car, and your goods or whatever else if something were to happen. And right now, that's not really the case. So those are things I think that need to be looked at. But while we look at those and try and find solutions to them, I would hope that we don't end up losing the whole thing. Because again, if I were a young person now, I would love to be able to just flick a switch and make some money driving around on an afternoon. And I think it would just be a big mistake to end that way of working.
Well, I think this raises the other issue, and I think that there's a fundamental sort of issue with the company's business model that I find actually really, really fascinating. And the inherent flaw here, if you're a driver, is that the more the company grows, right, the more Uber and Lyft grows, the more drivers there are on the streets. Then it becomes sort of a simple reality cam of, supply demand economics, right? I mean, the more drivers you have on the street, the lower the cost of the rides, right? Great for the consumer. The lower the cost of the rides, the less money the drivers themselves are making. So you have this sort of bizarre relationship where the more successful the company becomes, the less money the drivers themselves are making in propping up the company. And, and I think there's another problem here. And that's that you've got about, according to the stats here, there's about 3 million drivers in the United States that are receiving unemployment benefits right now. And these are all paid for by tax dollars, right? Yet Uber and Lyft, because of this independent contractor relationship, they haven't contributed anything to these benefits. So you do have drivers that are receiving some benefits through government subsidies, employment insurance, what have you. And yet Uber and Lyft are not contributing to these programs in any way. So in effect, you have tax dollars subsidizing their business model, whether they support it or not, which I think is sort of another interesting angle that's kind of been lost here.
Yeah, I mean, like I said off the top, the business model is going to have to adjust. I think if you're saying that these are employees, I honestly think that puts them out of business. I can't see how they can continue operating, at least this way. It would have to change the entire nature of the company. If we stand back and really look at this doesn't just apply to Uber and Lyft. There's a lot of companies out there that are the share economy, the gig economy, like Airbnb and things like that, where there's no regulations yet, or the regulations are very thin, or they're piecemeal. These changes have happened so fast that we haven't been able to adjust. And so even now, like for Airbnbs, in some cities, it's okay to stay there. Some it's not. Some apartment buildings will not let you rent out your property on short-term rentals. Some will. But there's no real consensus on how to manage this kind of thing. And I think these are all sort of kind of fallout from the tech revolution that we've gone through, which includes, the advertising and the fake news on Facebook and so on and so forth. These are all new challenges that have been created as a result of technology. And I think if we're going to try and do this piecemeal, bit by bit, it's not going to work. I think we need to look at it a little more holistically.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a really good point, and it's actually something that came up that I thought was interesting in the decision of the court itself, right? And this was something that the judge wrote. He said that to argue that Uber and Lyft drivers do not perform work that is outside the usual course of their business, right? For Uber and Lyft to argue that their businesses are quote unquote multi-sided platforms rather than transportation companies is flatly inconsistent. And this is the quote, flatly inconsistent with the statutory provisions that govern their businesses as transportation network companies, which are defined as companies that engage in the transportation of persons by motor vehicle for compensation, right? So
I think Uber would,
it's they would reject this argument to try and make that
they would reject
they
that,
are not these transportation companies. But to your point, and I think this is where you're absolutely right, Cam, is that, the court is effectively working within the statutory framework as it exists. And you're talking about companies and disruptors, and Airbnb being another great example where, they sort of are operating. We always talk about this sort of gray area, but the reality is that gray area exists because in many cases, the law has been slow to change or slow to recognize that a lot of these companies can't work within a traditional statutory framework. And until the law sort of catches up, I mean, a lot of these companies are going to get caught and continue to get caught, as is the case here with Uber and Lyft.
Uber would push back very hard on your characterization of it as a transportation company. So if you stand back, Uber looks at it like they have created an app, some technology, and all that technology does is link a driver out there with some demand. Someone who needs a ride somewhere. And that's all they do. They link these two people together and then they do business between themselves. And that's why they don't consider, they don't drive anyone anywhere. They create an app and they update the app and they make sure it's usable for the drivers and for the riders to do business among themselves. Now, that is a little disingenuous too, because obviously, I mean, it's a little more complicated than that, but I can certainly see that side of it. Uber's not hiring drivers and sending them out there to do work on behalf of Uber. It doesn't work that way. You're right. And of course, that was precisely the argument that Uber and Lyft made, right? That they're not a transportation network or company. They are a quote unquote multi-sided platform. This was the term that they used. But I mean, in response to precisely what you just said, I mean, again, this was another quote from the judge. He said, look, I mean, that argument, quote unquote, flies in the face of economic reality and common sense. To state the obvious, drivers are central, not tangential, to Uber and Lyft's entire ride-hailing business, right? So again, I think you're correct, and I think the judge is correct. I actually think both sides are right. I mean, I think Uber is sort of correct in stating that, well, look, we are a multi-sided platform, right? Absolutely. And I think the judge is also correct in stating that, well, yeah, but drivers are essential. They're central and essential to your business model. They're not tangential. I think, again, the problem here is that we're working within a statutory framework that, was created long before multi-sided quote unquote platforms existed and applications and ride hailing technology. And the statutes have yet to catch up. Yeah. And I think that's the primary and fundamental issue here. And this is going to get worse. I mean, the gig economy has been around now for 10 years probably, but I mean, there's new services coming out all the time, and this is not going to stop. And this is an example of governments not being too reactive, especially in the United States recently. I mean, when you have gridlock for long periods of time, these kind of issues cannot get resolved easily. And it's not just the U.S., but in general, I think we're going to have to get government that is far more reactive and far more quick at seeing these situations develop and being proactive and trying to find a solution.
We've got to move on. I just want to give the tail end of the story because it's not over yet, Cam. So on Thursday, an appeals court in California ruled that Lyft and Uber can continue to avoid classifying their drivers as employees. And they issued sort of a temporary stay on the order that would have forced the companies to immediately reclassify their drivers as employees. This stay was issued the day before the reclassification was to take effect. And the stay will remain in effect while Uber and Lyft, while their appeal works its way through the courts. And now here's what's really, really interesting about this. So the court has scheduled arguments on this issue for October 13th, but it's unlikely that the court will issue a final ruling before the U.S. election on November 3rd. And the reason that is significant is because on the ballot in California and we've talked about this, we talked about this in episode 12 as well, I believe, Cam, Proposition 22. And this will allow voters in California to decide whether they want to pass Proposition 22. And if it is passed, it would explicitly classify app-based drivers as contractors rather than employees. And Uber and Lyft have spent a great deal of money in getting this on the ballot. So this is far, 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 far from over.
I did see this. I would be so tempted, and I would not do this because in communications, you're supposed to be risk averse. I would be so tempted to pull services from now to the election. Because if you do that, I mean, there are a lot of people that rely on these two companies, especially in California. I'm sure that's their top market, actually, in the US and maybe globally. I mean, that's where it started, and that's where a lot of people use both companies. It would be very tempting to pull out of there and saying, like, we can't continue, because I think that galvanizes a lot of people to go to the ballot box on election day. If it's a service that they no longer have, that they relied upon, I think people would get out and galvanize to try and bring it back.
Well, yeah. I mean, there is Rideshare Drivers United. They claim that Uber and Lyft would owe more than $1.3 billion in payments to drivers in California if they were classified as employees. So, yeah, huge amount of money on the table here.
Yeah, we don't know how they calculate.
But one thing I wanted to ask you about, Cam, from a PR perspective, because I saw some people tweeting this out, that when they were sort of pulling up the app in California, Uber and Lyft, I can't remember which one of the apps it was, but it effectively would redirect to an advertisement on Prop 22 and why, it's important that the proposition passes. I mean, what are your thoughts of that on that sort of as a marketing PR tool from the company to sort of push that agenda through the app?
Yeah, absolutely. They have to do absolutely everything they can, because if this doesn't pass, they're in big trouble. And if they can't operate in California because of the size and the influence of California, I think it does put some of its other businesses into make them much more questionable. And also, too, because even a couple of years ago, Uber had operations all over the world, right? But they've been pulling back. I mean, obviously, that company has been very troubled. They had a really chaotic, crazy chief executive for a long time in Travis Kalanick. And also, SoftBank in Japan has invested in Uber, along with many other ride-sharing companies around the world. And through SoftBank, I mean, Masayoshi Son has decided to basically make sure that these companies are not competing in the same market, because it's driving the prices way down. So basically, these companies have divided up the world, and the US, and Uber is in the US, but it's no longer in many Asian countries like it used to be, because there's local competitors on the ground. So the scope of the business is not nearly as big as it was, actually, in terms of market size, than just a couple of years ago. It's much smaller now. So it has to be proactive. This is a do or die kind of initiative. I was thinking about, the approach. I mean, it's clear that you have to do everything you can, but then what is the most effective way to do that? And I think this is one of those situations where you're embarking on a campaign, and you need to have very clear messages. And I haven't seen them, but you would want to make it very clear about the benefits to the drivers in the current situation, the benefits to the passengers in the current situation, and why, if this doesn't pass, what is going to happen? What is the scenario? What do they lose? And I mean, those are messages that you'd want to be driving home. You'd want to make those very clear. You don't want to send a 5-page report on this. You want clear messages on these things and repeat them. They should have TV commercials. They should be on radio. They should be everywhere. In the app, I think it is distracting if you open the app and it whisks you off to a page, political page or something. I think it should do that maybe once, but I think it should say, look, and it should say, we need it. If someone's opening that app, it means they're either driving for Uber or they're taking Uber, right? Which means they're a customer in some way.
Right.
And so these are the people that you need supporting you. So yes, there should be a message sent there somewhere, or a dialogue box, or a pop-up or something that says, hey, can you take a look at this? It's important. And then after they do that once, not bring it up again. Maybe just before election day, perhaps. But that would be off the top of my head. But I think this sort of thing would require, this is the sort of thing where you sit down with your own communications team, you sit down with your government affairs team, and you sit down maybe with an agency, and really brainstorm this, the plan of attack between now and election day, which is 74 days away or something like that. It'd be a fun thing to do.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I get it. You see these sorts of situations in the legal world as well. These all or nothing cases where a company is prepared to spend whatever they need to spend from a legal perspective, because they understand that if they lose, the company's done. So you throw everything at the wall and you hope something sticks.
Here in Hong Kong, Uber is still not legal. But I mean, Uber in its previous incarnation, I mentioned Travis Kalanick. I mean, he went into markets and just literally disobeyed the law and did whatever he felt like. And he did that here. In fact, the government said you cannot drive Uber. They even arrested drivers. But they kept going. If you open Uber here, and I do take it from time to time, there's still drivers doing it because they're making money through it. But in Hong Kong, if there was a disagreement like this here, or a law that passed here, Uber could walk away and go, well, that's too bad. We lost one market, but so be it. California is not like that. California is critical to those companies. And so they're much more important than any other state, and probably other countries as well. And that's why they have to really throw everything at this that they've got.
Show your support to the PR and Law podcast by making a one-time donation or setting up a subscription with us on Patreon. Every little bit helps us keep the lights on and bring the show to you each week. If you'd like to chip in, please visit prandlawpodcast.com. That's prandlawpodcast.com. Click support the show. Thanks for helping us out.
All right, Ewan. I don't know if you saw this last week. I think there was so much news last week that maybe this was overshadowed a little bit, but it came across my desk, and it was another one of those instances where I thought, I wonder what's going to happen. There was a baseball game last week between the Cincinnati Reds and the Kansas City Royals. The game was held in Kansas City, and it was broadcast on Fox Sports Ohio. Are you familiar with this? Is this ringing any bells yet, Ewan?
No, I didn't hear anything about this.
All right. So the pregame show was underway. I mean, with baseball now too, there's no fans in the stands or anything like that, but the pregame show was underway. It was at commercial, and then it went back to the broadcast team, which didn't realize that it was on the air.
Oh, no.
And I'm going to play this. There is an expletive in this. I'm putting out the warning now. Actually, it's more of a very derogatory term. So pause now or cover your kids' ears. Here's what happened on that broadcast.
The fag capitals of the world. Reds Live, the pregame show presented by Racing.
Did you catch that?
Oh, I sure did. Wow.
So the person who said that is a guy named Brennaman, Thom Brennaman, and he is a longtime baseball broadcaster in Cincinnati. His father, I think, is in the Hall of Fame, who is also a broadcaster. So, this is his whole life is around this. And he made those remarks. Obviously, that would have ignited a bit of a firestorm. And then, not long after this, he had to reckon with this on the air. So this is the same baseball game, not long after he made that remark, because it was announced that they would pull him off the air mid-baseball game and replace him with another play-by-play guy. And here is what he had to say before that happened. And I want to mention there's one odd thing in here. Mid-apology, a Cincinnati player hits a home run. So there's a little bit of a weird sort of interlude in between this apology, but have a listen.
I made a comment earlier tonight that I guess went out over the air that I am deeply ashamed of. If I have hurt anyone out there, I can't tell you how much I say from the bottom of my heart. I'm so very, very sorry. I pride myself and think of myself as a man of faith. As there's a drive in a deep left field by Castellanos, it will be a home run. And so that'll make it a 4-0 ball game. I don't know if I'm going to be putting on this headset again. I don't know if it's going to be for the Reds. I don't know if it's going to be for my bosses at Fox. I want to apologize for the people who signed my paycheck, for the Reds, for Fox Sports Ohio, for the people I work with, for anybody that I've offended here tonight. I can't begin to tell you how deeply sorry I am. That is not who I am, and never has been. And I'd like to think maybe I could have some people that could back that up. I am very, very sorry, and I beg for your forgiveness.
Okay.
Was he sincere? Did he convince you?
Well, look, I'm sure he was sincere by the end there. He clearly is aware of the fact he's going to lose his job, that his reputation is destroyed. He'll never be in the Hall of Fame like his father. He's cooked. But what I always find so difficult about some of these apologies is that, you always hear this sentiment of like, it's not who I am. And the comment with regard to his being a man of faith, as if somehow that has any bearing on making a homophobic remark. I mean, I never really quite understand why that's one of the sort of go-to comments.
That's the one thing that actually kind of bothered me to some degree in that apology, because it actually draws negative attention to people with faith. It hurts other people who actually do have faith and live out those faiths every day, because clearly he's not a very good representative of that based on the remark he had made previously.
No, and look, and here's the thing, Cam. I mean, we all say things that are inappropriate from time to time that we regret, but it's something entirely different to just so casually pull out, a homophobic slur like that. I mean, those aren't the sorts of comments that you just casually make. Maybe you accidentally drop an F-bomb, or you say something, you swear or drop another expletive in front of a boss or a colleague or something because you're upset and it's inappropriate. But a racial slur or a homophobic remark, I mean, that has to come from somewhere deep rooted, deep down inside, that is the word that you grasp for. And I'm sorry, I think, I think clearly that is part of who he is. I mean, to be able to make a remark like that so casually, seconds before you're going back on the air, I mean, that certainly suggests that it's a comment he probably makes with some frequency.
The fag capitals of the world.
Now, I played that again because it's his tone that I find quite startling. It's very dismissive. It's very derogatory. It's somewhat aggressive. It sounds somewhat angry. That's the part. It wasn't. I mean, there's never an okay time to use this sort of a homophobic slur, but even in the way he delivered it, I think it made it worse. And so this is a big issue in the United States in general with so-called cancel culture. All of these sorts of incidents. This is merely the latest one that we have to contend with. So I do want to mention what happened after this. So he was taken off the broadcast, and the Cincinnati Reds. So this is a little bit complicated, but oftentimes when a sports franchise has a contract to give to a broadcast team, sometimes they employ them themselves. So the Cincinnati Reds actually suspended him almost immediately after that. Brennaman did release his own statement, and he released it from a company called Steinlight Media, which I looked up, and it is a PR firm in New York City that deals with sports. I see they've got a lot of sports clients. And the statement said, "I would like to sincerely apologize for the inappropriate comments I made during last night's telecast. I made a terrible mistake. To the LGBTQ community and all people I have hurt or offended, from the bottom of my heart, I am truly sorry. I respectfully ask for your grace and forgiveness." The Cincinnati Reds, for their part, also put out a statement that said the organization is devastated by the horrific homophobic remark. They said that they will address the rest of their broadcasting team in the coming days, and also said the LGBTQ plus community in Cincinnati, Kansas City, and all across this country and beyond. Apologized to all of those people and beyond. And then Fox Sports Ohio also obviously said that the comment was hateful, offensive, and does not reflect the values of Fox Sports Ohio. So that's where we're at. The Steinlight Media was interesting. I did look it up, like I said. Interestingly, the principal behind that, who has the surname Steinlight, follows me on Twitter. I was very tempted to give him a message to bring him on the show, but I don't think he's going to talk about this subject.
Oh, maybe we should.
As much as it would be great to get him on. But I think that the issue here really isn't even what he said this time in this baseball game. The question is, should people lose their careers for these kinds of offenses? And I have to tell you, I don't think that's an easy question to answer, because I can understand on both sides. Like, to me, the statement itself is just, there's no way to justify that in any way. It's not like it was out of context, or it's not like it's kind of a word on the line. Like, some people take it some way, some don't. Like, it's very clearly a slur, and he very clearly said it, and he meant it to be a slur. So it's just not debatable at all. But then the question of, okay, should people lose their careers for that? That's a very tough question. I don't have an answer for it.
Well, look, let's put the politics aside. Let's put cancel culture aside, and let's, just for the sake of argument, because we can, let's look to it from a legal framework. I'm thinking if this was, I'm going to just move it from Cincinnati to Ontario here for the sake of convenience, and assume that this was a Toronto Blue Jays broadcast. If that slur was dropped, it's cause for discharge. Absolutely. In a legal framework, you terminate that employee and you pay them nothing. And why? Because they have immediately and significantly compromised your brand. They're a high profile member of the business, and they are there to promote and grow the brand. And if you impact the brand significantly from the company's perspective, that's it. I mean, yeah, you can be gone. Even though it's an isolated incident, you could make a compelling argument in that situation that it's cause for discharge. Even if the guy had been a great employee for a number of years, I think that there's a compelling argument there. And that's a legal perspective. That's sort of removing any of the other aspects of it, where we can sort of engage in some of that gray area conduct.
I think some people misunderstand that point that you're making as well. People see it as some sort of punishment for saying the wrong thing. Kind of people want to be thought police, and so they see him a little bit as a victim. And I'm not even talking about him specifically, Brennaman specifically, but just in general, sort of the people who end up getting called out for their behavior. But you made a very good point. It's about the brand, and it's about what they stand for. So I cannot think under what kind of circumstance you could put him back on the air calling a regular baseball game again, because it's going to draw so much attention, and it's going to draw so much attention to the Cincinnati Reds and to Fox Sports Ohio, because then the complaint goes beyond Brennaman and goes to his bosses and the owners of the baseball team saying, why you're okay with this? You having him back on means you're okay with what he said. And even if they come out and say that they're not okay, which they have done, it gives the impression that they're okay with it. And I do kind of have a problem with this. I think it's really unfortunate that we can never tell who's sincere, who's not. We assume that this is obviously part of who he is. Based on the way he said it, it certainly sounds that way. But there's no way to know for sure. And he's losing a lot. I think he has to be taken off the air. Again, if I'm looking at this from a PR perspective, we talked about this with the Sarah Cooper, I think her name, from a long time ago, in Central Park, the sort of racist woman in Central Park. You can't associate your brand with that at all. You just got to move on and get this behind them as quickly as they can. For him, it's unfortunate because, obviously his father's life and his life have been in baseball and in calling games. I think I read he's done it for 27 years for the Cincinnati Reds. I mean, that's a long time. So this is devastating to him. I'm sure it's going to be devastating to him. But he should have been more careful.
Yeah. You know what? And again, this is also just a problem with professional sports. And we've talked about this before that, particularly with the NHL, right? The NHL has an image and a branding problem in this regard, in that you're often seeing instances of sort of misogynistic commentary or homophobic commentary. And as such, if you want to grow your brand and attract a new and broader audience, you have to condemn this kind of content. And again, that's like putting the legal issues aside for a moment and looking at it more from a business perspective or a political, social perspective. I mean, it's funny, just you're reminding me earlier this week, Cam, there was a play-by-play guy here in that calls NHL games, whose name
it's Mike Milbury.
Something.
Yeah, Mike Milbury. He's not in Canada though. He's with NBC. He's actually a former Boston Bruins GM, and I think he was with the Islanders as well. But yes, it's very good that you just brought this up. I'm glad you reminded me of it. But he did. Yeah. Did
you see or hear the comment that he made? And this was live on air. This wasn't even it wasn't an off air comment.
The baseball one was on air too.
Sorry?
The baseball one was on air too, just inadvertently on air.
Right. Well, but this was actually during the game. This was, there was no argument that, well, he didn't mean to say it on air, or he didn't know that people were listening. And it was, it was a comment.
I've got the clip. I've got the clip. I've got the clip. Let's play it.
Great.
I just pulled it up. Let's hear what he has to say.
Come here and play hockey. And if you think about it, it's a terrific environment with regards to, if you enjoy playing and enjoy being with your teammates for long periods of time, it's a perfect place.
Not even any woman here to disrupt their concentration.
Oh, and also, too, no travel.
So he said, and so to be clear, they're playing hockey in a bubble. So obviously the players are all trapped in there until the end of the playoffs. And he made the remark that there's no women to distract them. And the interesting part of that clip is that his colleagues, there's 3 in the booth. Nobody said a word. Just went by like any other comment.
They just moved on. And I saw Sarah Spain, who works with ESPN. She sent out a great tweet that I retweeted, and all she said was, "Fellas, what are we doing, and why, and for how much longer?" And I really think it sort of underscores again the point, right? You want to grow your brand, you want to attract a newer, broader audience. This isn't the way that you do it. Yeah, I think businesses, they have to take a strong stance from a business perspective, because it's impacting the bottom line, right? But again, I think in the Reds case, even putting the business case, the political issues aside, there's a compelling legal argument to say, look, he's impacting your brand. It's detrimental to your brand. He's a public face of the brand, and he really screwed up. It's cause for discharge. Let him go. The end.
Yeah. Last thing I want to say on this too, I think it's interesting that these comments, especially the one by Mike Milbury, said without a care in the world, and not even the faintest idea that it might be problematic. In the baseball example, they were off at break. So clearly he knew that it wasn't okay for on air, but at the same time, he obviously thought it was fine to say. I mean, that it's just fine to make those remarks because he said it so casually. And I think when people talk about sort of white privilege or these kinds of things, I think this is kind of what people are talking about to some degree. It's these remarks that people don't even think twice about because it's natural to them. It's okay. No one's going to call them on it. It's just part of the normal course of business in the day. And that's changing, obviously. And so people who remain saying these things and keep saying these things are now getting called out more and more, which I think is good. But it's certainly a learning process for them, but clearly they've got a long way to go, and especially in sports, like we've talked about.
Yeah. And that's you hit the nail on the head there, that it's normal course, that this sort of discussion, this sort of language is inherent and indicative of the culture. We're not talking about something that was, an individual was provoked in such a way that they then came out with this grossly inappropriate comment from deep down. I mean, this is just normal course. And that almost makes it worse, that just in a casual, off the cuff fashion, they can drop these kinds of comments. And that's what's really, really problematic about it for me.
I want to close by saying one thing here. I mean, I'm not coming on either side of the so-called cancel culture, which is a whole show or podcast series unto itself. So we're not going to get into all of that here. But I will say, though, I'm not up for piling on. I think, clearly, I have no doubt that this baseball broadcaster is mortified about the fallout of his remarks. He may even feel as though he is a victim or he has been treated unjustly. I'm sure he probably does feel that way. And I think he's seen his life's work suddenly called into question. There's always going to be this now, after his 27 years in the business. This one comment overshadows all of that. And if that were me, I would be absolutely devastated, because you've lost your standing among your peers. And so this is not to say he should or should not be punished, but I do feel like, okay, he made the remark. He's been suspended. He'll probably be removed. He'll probably lose his position. We don't need to pile on after that. I think he will never, ever forget this beyond today.
My last point on this, Cam, is we're also assuming that this was an isolated case or a one-off. Again, given the circumstances, if I was advising the employer, I would want to investigate the matter further. I'd want to speak with some of his colleagues. This could quite possibly be a pattern of behavior that's long existed and nobody's spoken up about it in the past, and maybe they will now.
And usually if there's one case, there are others.
Wait a minute.
Check this out.
Whoa, hey, check this out. No, wait. Check it out.
I want you to check this out.
On the PR and Law Podcast.
All right, I will mention one thing here, and I have to comp to this. I have not even read this yet. I have talked before on the show. I'm a huge fan of The Atlantic. I think they just do excellent work. I've known some people who work there. James Follows is one of their longest serving columnists or authors, writers who I do know personally to some degree. We've emailed back and forth and sort of shared some ideas and things like that. But I think their writing is excellent, and I'm very happy to say that by the way, they're not sponsoring the show. I'm not being paid to say this. But they've done amazing work during the pandemic, in fact. And I know that their paid subscriptions and their traffic is way up, which is good news. But they have done another feature, and it relates to something we've talked about before. And the title is What Ellen's Kindness Concealed. And the subtitle is The Recent Scandal at Her Talk Show Suggests that the host's smiling facade covers up something dark and hints at why that facade had to be created in the first place. And I will put a link to this. When we wrap up the show, this is the first thing that I will be reading when I go to bed shortly. And I think what it hints at is something I think I mentioned on the previous show when we talked about Ellen. I'll put a link in the show notes. I can't remember if it was episode 16 or 15 or somewhere around there. That it has been known for a very long time that she's been, not a nice person. And I think I mentioned that Adam Carolla, another longtime podcaster, said that oftentimes the people that put on the nicest character on screen are the ones that are the least nice off screen, and that it's a compensation. And this looks like it's going down that path, this article.
Okay. I'll have to, you can perhaps read it while you're going to bed, and I'll read it while I pour another cup of coffee, Cam. So
I need a cup of coffee. What have you got, dog?
So Cam, I'm sure you've probably heard this particular sentiment or phrase over the past few months. People saying to you, "Oh yeah, it's Groundhog Day. Every day is exactly the same."
Yes.
I've heard this so many times, and I have never seen the movie Groundhog Day. The 1993 movie with Bill Murray.
Mm-hmm.
And it occurred to me that I was dropping my daughter off at preschool, and I was speaking with one of the preschool teachers and just saying, "Hey, how are you doing? How have things been with you?" And again, well, it's just Groundhog Day. Every day is exactly the same. And I came home, and later that evening before I went to bed, I was reading a top 50 movies on Netflix. It was a New York Times article. And one of the films on the list was Groundhog Day. And I said, okay, that's it. I'm going to find time. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to watch Groundhog Day. And I did it yesterday afternoon. I should have been doing some work, but I was just, I was tired. I'd had a busy week, and I thought, you know what? Now's the time. Let's do it. Let's dance, Bill Murray. So I sat down and I watched Groundhog Day. And you know what? It's a pretty great movie. It's almost 30 years old. So obviously from an employment lawyer perspective, there's all kinds of issues. I mean, you basically have Bill Murray making a bunch of inappropriate moves on his producer. So, I mean, there's all kinds of sort of gender politic issues there and employment law issues there. But if we can sort of put that aside, and I think you probably can, because there's all kinds of other merit to the film. It is interesting. And I thought that there was a really good takeaway in this movie, given what's going on. And that's that, the basic premise, right, Cam? Bill Murray basically keeps living the same day.
I remember
over and over
when it came out
again.
Yep.
And, he sort of starts off basically just really, really upset about the idea. And he goes through this sort of transitionary process. And it almost was sort of in keeping with many people's approach through the pandemic as well, right? There's periods of kind of dismay and he's bitter, and then there's sort of despair, and then he tries to kill himself repeatedly, and there's just this total cynicism. But then he turns a corner, and he decides that, well, wait a minute, there's an opportunity here. And he takes the fact that he keeps repeating the same day over and over again, and he starts to learn things. And that was the sort of the takeaway for me. And I was thinking about this show and the fact that really we probably wouldn't be doing this were it not for the pandemic. I know we had been talking about doing something like this for years, but I think the pandemic was really sort of the catalyst. It was the kick in the ass we needed to get going, and I think that that's sort of a great takeaway from this movie. Bill Murray learns to play the piano. He learns to read. He reads French poetry. He learns all of these sort of new and interesting things on account of the fact that he just keeps living the same day over and over and over again. So I hope that our listeners and the people out there, that they've taken this time or going forward will take this time to learn something new, either about themselves or perhaps a new trade or a new hobby or something. Because I think there really is this sort of wonderful opportunity here to get out and do something new.
All right. You in with the way back track there, going with the 93 movie. I like it. I do remember when it came out. I haven't watched it either. And I think you make a very good point. I think there is a lot of time, or maybe not necessarily a lot of time, but being home, not being able to go out, that means you're maybe not sitting in a restaurant, or you're not going to a movie out, or you're not, meeting friends out somewhere. And so that time can be put to good use if you've got some interests and hobbies and things like that. Unfortunately, I mean, especially here in Hong Kong, I do know quite a few people without hobbies if they're very work focused, which I think is a whole other sort of issue for people to deal with if they're in that boat. But I think you're right. I mean, for us, we've launched the podcast. I mean, I've done some other things as well, working on sort of side projects that I'm interested in that I've been able to give a little more attention to. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that's really the upside of this. But I think, and it just hit me even today and yesterday, I was thinking about travel again. Something reminded me, and I thought, I would like now some sort of break in this routine, because I'm not angry or upset or bored even, but the monotony is kind of setting in a little bit. Like a whole year is going by where I haven't stepped on an airplane. I mean, I did fly in January. I haven't taken a day off work. I haven't taken one day off work this year. Things like that. And you just think, it does feel weird when it just is repetitive day after day, even though you are being productive. And I think vacations, travel, meeting family, friends, going out, doing things, those are the really nice sort of breaks in your day-to-day routine and responsibilities. And we're without those at the moment. And it's been fine with me for a very long time, but I think now I'm starting to feel a little bit of that.
Yeah, and I get that. And I think it's, it's easy to say, hey, go out and learn to speak a new language, or, learn to bake.
You have to want to do it too. It's got to be something.
Yeah,
you're interested in.
You have to feel motivated, and it's often very, very difficult to feel motivated with what's going on. But whatever it takes, whatever we need to do to sort of smack ourselves across the face and get up and get motivated, try and look at what's going on as an opportunity, because it is an opportunity. You're right. All of those other things that you might otherwise be doing under normal circumstances, if it does free a unit of time, it's a unit of time you can use that way to learn to do something else. Try, just try, set aside 15 minutes in your schedule, block it off in your calendar or what have you, to do something new and different.
We have this newfangled World Wide Web that we can go surfing on to find information. It's really cool, and I recommend people use it because you can find out how to do almost anything, read about almost anything. Even to this day, Ewan, I am surprised. Sometimes people ask me a question about something, or how would I know about that, or how can I do this? And I think you don't think about going to Google. Like, everyone knows we can go to Google to do things, but we can go to it for almost everything. Like, there's a lot there that I don't even think cross people's mind a lot of the time. And I think we've never had more opportunity at our fingertips than we do now, because even if you're just starting a blog or a music class, or you can almost do all of that, advertise it, launch it, get it running all through the internet. And so make use of this amazing resource that previous generations never had.
Yeah, I totally agree. And again, sometimes that can be really overwhelming though, right? The idea that it's almost like stepping out into the abyss, just this big black openness, and it's hard to know where to begin. And as you know, Cam, I'm a research nerd. It's probably part of why I ended up being a lawyer in the first place. I love to research topics exhaustively. Any major purchases I make, I feel compelled to sort of research them exhaustively. But I think, if you have to apply some sort of framework, because otherwise it can be overwhelming. So make a list. Start. What is it that you want to learn about? Maybe you want to learn to play. You want to learn to play guitar. Well, then make a list. What kind of music are you interested in? If you're looking to buy guitar, what's your price point? I mean, you create a list of all of these points and the framework, and then it becomes a little less overwhelming. So that when you start doing that research, you step onto Google or what have you, you have a framework that you're working within, right? It's almost like an outline for an essay that we're sort of taught to do in high school. Create an outline for yourself. And I think once you have something jotted down on paper, that general outline, that framework, then everything else can kind of quickly fall into place.
I want to add one thing to that before we sign off. The other thing I would add is when you do a search for something that you're looking for, or something that you're interested in maybe starting or studying or whatever, and you click a link and you end up on a page with information, a lot of people read the information, close the tab, and that's it. And I encourage you to, if the information is useful, if it's written away where you think, yes, I have to save this, look at the name of the site, go to the homepage. Do they have other stuff? Is this really helpful? And then bookmark it. Save it. Actually, after a few weeks of reading about a subject, you'll end up with 2 or 3 or 4 really, really good sources of information that you can save, and delete all the others. You don't need to go across the entire internet, but almost on every subject, there's going to be a couple of really useful sites where people who are already doing what you're thinking of doing have written about it. And you want to find those, and then you can follow those, and it makes it a lot less overwhelming when you're going through that process.
Yeah, that's great. That's great advice too.
Anything else, Dog, before we put this one in the books?
I think that's it. That's it.
All right. Yeah, we talked about a lot of stuff today, so that's good. Always lively, Ewan, even though it's 20 minutes to 1 o'clock in the morning, Hong Kong time. I'm going to bed. So anyway,
go to bed.
Yes. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, please tell a friend. It's the only way we have to get word out about the show. So that means a lot to us. You can follow us on social media on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. The account name is PR Law Podcast. And we're also on YouTube and SoundCloud as well. So you can subscribe from either of those and support us on Patreon. Just visit our website, prlawpodcast.com, and click support the show. So, for you and Christy, this is Cam McMurchie. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week.
This has been the PR and Law Podcast with Cam McMurchie and Ewan Christie. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with a friend or leave a review. You can also join us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook by following our account at PR Law Podcast. That's all one word, PRLAW Podcast. Thanks for your support.
Cam and Ewan, strong guys.